Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to life on the North Fork of Long Island. Some are rooted here by generations, others arrived by chance or choice, but all carry with them a piece of the story. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 139, we sit down with Michael Zweig, SUNY Stony Brook professor, emeritus, and longtime labor scholar and activist. We trace his early life from his family's flight from Nazi Europe to his upbringing in Detroit and his move to Long Island. Zweig shares what first sparked his passion for labor and social justice, explains how class still shapes American life, and explores the rise of inequality, corporate power, and authoritarianism. He also reflects on his work with international labor movements and offers powerful advice on how scholars and activists can stay truly connected to the communities they serve, not just study from afar. This is part one of our conversation. In the next episode, we focus on Michael's work in Southold and the efforts to protect Long Island's North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 139 with Michael Zweig. This episode was recorded April 30th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And now, just in the beginning, can you take us back a bit? What first sparked your interest in issues of class, labor, and social justice? Was there a moment or experience early on that really set you on this path?
Yes, there was. I'm the first person in my family born in America. I come from an immigrant family. English is not my first language. My parents came with my brother in their arms from Vienna in 1938 to get away from Hitler and to get away from the Nazi Holocaust that was then brewing and, of course, happened. And as I was growing up, some families talked about the Holocaust and what had happened to the Jewish people, and others didn't. And I came from a family that did talk about it. And my mother and father, and my mother in particular, were very much involved in bitter memories of their friends lost, of family who had been captured and tortured and murdered, and people who, as my father said, went up the chimney in our family, and that we had come, or they had come to America to get away from all of that, and that America was a place that was safe from that. It was, allowed us to survive, allowed our family to survive, and that so I could be born here before my parents even became citizens. I was born in Detroit in 1942, and English, as I say, was not my first language. I got out onto the street, and you don't speak German on the streets of Detroit in 1946. So I learned English, and then, of course, I went to school, and I learned English some more, but still I spoke German at home with my parents. And then in 1955, there was the murder of Emmett Till, and his mother had held an open casket funeral for him. And for those who are listening to this don't know who Emmett Till was, Emmett Till was a boy who was living in Chicago, but who had grown up in Mississippi, and his parents had moved up to Chicago, but in the summer sent him back to Mississippi to stay with his uncle and to be in the country and to be away from the city and the polio that was in the city and so on. And he had been lynched and murdered in 1955. And I saw those open casket pictures of Emmett Till. At that time, he was 14 and I was 13.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew that I came from people who had been lynched and murdered, and we had come to America to be safe from that. And here it was. And I just thought, really in an epiphanal moment, this can't be. I have to do something to stop this. Whatever it takes, I can't allow this to happen. This can't be in my country. And so that got me started thinking about social problems and social issues, I guess when I was 13.
Mm.
Now, I grew up in Detroit, in the city, and it's a union town. It's the UAW, it's the Teamsters, it's Walter Reuther, it's Jimmy Hoffa. And so it was a city and an environment that was steeped in worker rights and in worker activism and in labor unions. The UAW was a very sort of class-conscious and open-minded union that had a very broad agenda of interest, not just the terms and conditions of employment in plants, but they were interested in Social Security questions, in healthcare issues, in all kinds and manner of social concerns. And that interested me. And that it was an avenue, together with many other things that were going on in Detroit, that I could hook up with and learn from and participate and try to make this country a place where Emmett Till wouldn't be lynched. And I, got a sense then that what had happened to Emmett Till had happened to me, to my family. And so there was a sense of comradeship.
Yes.
And a sense of mutual concern and interest and fate. And so there was the beginning of my interest in social justice questions.
No, it kind of brings you really from the beginning, even with your parents and coming over here, and just interesting to hear that, how it came about. But I was curious a little bit about your ancestry, and you mentioned Austria. How far back can you go with your parents' ancestry within that area?
Well, I think that there is documentation going back to the 1850s with a great-great-great-grandfather who was a lumber merchant in Poland, or what was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but in what had been Poland and then later became Poland again, which is where my mother was born and raised, in what is now Ukraine, right on the border of Ukraine and Poland. And my dad was raised in Vienna, in the imperial capital of the Habsburg Empire. And so I had some sense of what life was like in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And once I remember I asked my mother how it was that our family came to live in this Pechenesian in Stanisław. And she said to me, Michael, to understand that, you have to understand Napoleon. And so she brought me all the way back to Napoleon and what Napoleonic Code meant for the Jewish people and the freedom that came to Jews in the areas that Napoleon dominated. And so our ancestors had come from the Pale in Russia and then had moved because of the freedom that was allowed to the Jewish people in Napoleonic areas, and ended up in Stanisław and in Pechenesian.
And then I was just wondering what your parents did for a living while working in Vienna.
Well, my father was an engineer. He grew up in Vienna. He went to a technical high school, a really good gymnasium, as it was called. And when he wanted to study engineering, this would have been in the early 1920s. He was born in 1903. So in the early 1920s, he was ready to do college work in engineering. But he moved to Germany himself personally because the anti-Semitism in Vienna was so thick that he went to the relative freedom of Dresden and Leipzig to learn engineering skills. And he became a very skilled structural engineer. My mother was an early childhood specialist, a teacher in the Montessori school method, which then had something to do with how she raised me and my brother because she knew something about early childhood. And they had, a professional sort of middle class kind of environment as they were growing up. My mother's father, my grandfather, Gerson Froelich, was a factory manager, a textile factory in Stanisław, and had those skills. And my dad's father, my grandfather on my father's side, was an accountant, lived in Vienna.
And I think I remember even in the 1910s in Vienna, there was a moment when Vienna did switch to a more, I don't know if it was a more communist system within that time, they Red Vienna, but they were doing more these big housing complexes throughout the city. But at the same time, I think there was that going on, but then there was that rise in anti-Semitism at the same
very
time.
much. There was various political strands that were operating, but the dominant strand in my father's memory and in what I learned about was the very, very bitter anti-Semitism. And there was a period of Red Vienna, but then that got dominated by the fascists.
Yes.
By the 1920s and 30s, it just was impossible for Jews there.
And was there any relation to Stefan Zweig?
My mother thought that there was a relation to Stefan Zweig, actually. She claimed that because I think she wanted it. But I think she could never really demonstrate, on a family tree, this father and that grandmother and this cousin, and there's Stefan Zweig. You see right there on the family tree. Never developed that. But Stefan Zweig, of course, was a very prominent and very important figure in Vienna, and then lived in Salzburg.
Yes.
And I have had the opportunity to visit his home in Salzburg on the Kapuzinerberg, and then also just read his works when I was growing up.
Yes.
And whether was there a family connection, probably not.
But it's still interesting to...
Very interesting guy.
Yeah. And now just in terms of that process of coming over to the U.S., how did your parents decide on, or was there a decision in going to Detroit at that point? How they made their way there?
My mother had a brother who had come to America when he was 17 years old in 1920. And he came alone. He had an uncle, my mother's uncle also, who lived in New Jersey and was a worker. And so my uncle came and he went to work. And he went to college. He went to CCNY. He went to City College. And then he decided he wanted to be a doctor. He went to the University of Michigan and became a doctor. He went to medical school. And by the time the middle 1930s and end of the 1930s came along, he was an established physician, internal medicine, but also psychiatry. And so he was able to arrange the maneuvering to get immigration papers for his sister and brother-in-law, my mother and father, and their infant son. So that's, a whole story there about how he managed to do that. But my parents came in August 1938. They arrived with my brother, who was then 15 months old. And they were not able to get anybody else out from the family. So no one else survived, except a couple of people. My grandmother, on my mother's side, who fled east with an aunt, and everybody had different stories of survival. Some passed. One person passed as an Aryan because he spoke very good Polish. He didn't speak Polish with a Yiddish accent, which a lot of shtetl Jews, Polish was the second language. So they couldn't pass, but he could, and he was very clever, and he could forge documents. So he did survive, and ultimately came to America, and I knew him. But a lot of people, as my father said, went up the chimney.
And then just to get to you a bit, now that you were in Detroit, you mentioned a bit earlier with growing up there, and but in terms of your school experience and coming out of high school, did you know exactly what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
No, 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 I didn't. My father was an engineer. My brother had been also before me at the University of Michigan. He was a math and physics major. And by the time I got to Ann Arbor as a freshman, my brother was already a graduate student at Caltech in the physics department. And so the idea was that I was also going to be in the engineering or science aspect of life. And I got to Ann Arbor, and I was in the honors program, and then within the honors program, there was a thing called the Unified Science Program, which was sort of the honors of the sciences, where you took physics and math and chemistry and biology. It was interesting in biology. I took a class, and one of the things that was really exciting, this was in 1961, was the helix model of DNA, which had just been discovered. And everybody in the biological sciences was so excited to try to understand the implications of this double helix, DNA and RNA, and what is that, and how, what do these letters stand for, and how is, wait a minute, what is this? And so I was in that environment in my classes, in my schoolwork. But in February 1960, February 1st, were those sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina at the Woolworths, where those 4 black students came and wouldn't get up until they got served at the Woolworths lunch counter, which didn't serve black people. Black people could come in and buy things, but they couldn't sit at the lunch counter. So these kids sat at the lunch counter. And they were arrested and beaten and had ketchup thrown on their heads, and all kinds of stuff was going on. And so they're generated in the early part of 1960 these picket lines around Woolworths stores all around the country. Because integrate Woolworths, and it was a national chain, and so it was a target for picket lines and sit-ins and stuff going on all around the country. And I got to Ann Arbor in September 1960, and there was a picket line in front of the Woolworths on North University and State Street. And I saw that picket line. And I come from Detroit, I know about picket lines. So I go and I say, what's this all about? And they tell me, and I say, oh, yeah. Yeah, that was really bad what happened down there in North Carolina. Now, then I had to think, do I want to get on this picket line? Because if I'm on this picket line and I'm walking on this picket line, what if somebody sees me and asks me, what am I doing out there? And I had an uncle. That uncle lived in Ann Arbor. He was a professor at the medical school. And I had to think, what if my uncle sees me on his picket line? How would I explain it? And I thought, yeah, I could explain it. So I got on a picket line. And I stayed active in the civil rights movement in Ann Arbor as it developed, and helped to organize the Ann Arbor chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. Ann Arbor didn't have a chapter. We organized it. I did with several other people, other students, some faculty. So in my life, not my academic work, but in my life, I was walking picket lines, I was getting arrested, I was being told that I was threatening my career and I should go home and be good and blah, 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 and all this stuff. And I just got deeper and deeper into trying to end racism in this country. Again, coming back off of that Emmett Till story.
Yes.
And by the time I got to my sophomore year, middle of my sophomore year, I decided I'm not going to do science anymore. I want to understand society. Here I am doing all this stuff, but I don't really know why there's racism. I don't really know why there are all these things going on. I don't know why there's picket lines at an auto plant. You know, I know that there are, and I know that I want to be on that picket line too with the auto workers that are on strike against GM or trying to fix something up at Dodge, Maine, you know, where they have a local issue. So I thought, well, I better study society. And I didn't have any idea what that meant. And I remember I went to the bookstore. First, I looked in the university catalog. What are the courses about society? Okay, so there's history, there's sociology, there's anthropology, there's economics, there's political science. And I went through and I wrote them all down on a little piece of paper, and I went to the bookstore. And I looked at the introductory texts of all of these different fields of study. And I had never heard of economics before. Really, I'd never heard of it as a field. Or the economy. That was not anything. I knew about a stock market, but I didn't know there was such a thing as an economy.
Yeah.
So I looked at all these textbooks, and of all these different fields, the one that I thought I needed the most help with was economics. If I pick up an introductory economics textbook, I couldn't figure out what the hell they were talking about. You know, with history I didn't know what they were talking about, but at least I could read it and understand the words.
Yes.
But when I got into the economics thing, I don't know what's going on here. So that I better study this. So that's why I decided to major in economics.
Okay.
And I continued with my studies in economics, eventually got a PhD, also from Ann Arbor, from the University of Michigan. And then came here to the State University of New York at Stony Brook in 1967 to teach economics.
And were you thinking, at that point, even before coming over here, were you set on staying in Michigan at that point, or did you think you were going to move around? Or
I didn't think about it. I just thought, this is what I want to do. I didn't have any idea I wanted to be an academic. What I wanted to be was a lawyer, because I had seen in the civil rights movement the tremendously important role that attorneys were playing in fighting cases in the courts about segregation and about desegregation and this, that, the schools and the workplace and all these other questions where there was so much work going on in courts. And I thought, there's a thing that I could do. I could be a lawyer. And I got told by people in the law school in Ann Arbor that I would be a good lawyer, but that I would never be a lawyer because I had these arrests in the civil rights stuff. And that would mean that I could never pass the morals test of the bar associations of any state. I could get a law degree, but I would never be admitted to any bar because I had these convictions. You know, for trespassing, and I mean, they weren't big felony things, but nonetheless, there was a disrespect for the law there, right, in civil disobedience, that I was told in 1963 would block me from going further in the profession. Now, it turned out that was wrong. It turned out to be a badge of honor, ultimately, at least in certain circles, so that I could have actually gone ahead and been a lawyer, but I didn't know that, and so I gave that up. And then I decided I wanted to be an economist in the UAW, the United Auto Workers. It's a union, but as I mentioned earlier, they had a very broad scope of interest. They weren't just thinking about, we're going to be in this battery factory negotiating a contract, we better understand the economic condition of the firm. And that you have a research department that does that. But they were also interested in what's going on. How do we get universal health care for people in this country? How do we consolidate Social Security? And ultimately like Medicare? Those kinds of questions were very deep questions that the union was taking an interest in, at least the UAW was. And so I got interested in working there, and I knew people in the UAW, and I sort of got to know Nat Weinberg, who was the head of the research department. And so I was going to get a PhD and then go to work for Nat in the UAW headquarters in Detroit, 8000 East Jefferson at the Solidarity House. Well, that didn't work out so well either, because when I was getting ready to get my PhD, which was in 1967, in early 67, I went to Nat Weinberg and I said, look, I'm getting a PhD. You know, how do I now transition into working for you? And he said, well, you know, Michael, you're the head of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society at the University of Michigan. And you're against the war in Vietnam. Our union is supporting the president in his war. We support that war. We think that it's important to defeat the communists everywhere in the world, and we support President Johnson. And you can be against the war personally, but you can't do anything publicly to express an opposition to the war, because that violates the policy of our union. Right? And union means one. And you can't just go off and be whatever you want to be if the union has this position. And I understood that completely. And I said, well, if I have to shut up about the war in Vietnam in 1966 and 1967, this is before Tet. Right? This is before Walter Cronkite said the war has been lost. But I was, very much involved in that anti-war movement. And so I just said, well, I guess I'm not working for you. And so that career blew up. But then there came this opportunity to teach. I thought, well, let me see what that is. And I had an opportunity. I had an offer at Kansas State University to teach in the economics department in Manhattan, Kansas. I went down and had a visit and gave a talk, and they liked it, and they offered me a job. But they had a loyalty oath, an old-fashioned, I am not a communist, I never have been, I never will be, I don't, denounce, blah, blah. And I said, I'm not signing any loyalty oath. No, you can't.
That was something they still had. That was kind of
from
the McCarthy type.
That's right. That was still around in some places.
Yes.
It was not in New York.
Yes.
But it was in Kansas. And so I said to them, well, if you really want me to come, get an exemption or put an end to this in the state of Kansas, which they couldn't or wouldn't do, so I didn't go there. But this position opened up at Stony Brook, which was a new university. It was just hiring. It was just getting started. And so they were building all different kinds of departments. And I got hired into the economics department. They wanted a radical. They wanted somebody who was challenging, the economic hierarchy in some way, intellectually,
Yes.
as well as, challenging what was going on in the world. And so they were sympathetic to that kind of approach. And so I got a job. And that's what brought me out of Michigan to Long Island.
And maybe just briefly, if you wanted to talk about what you thought of Long Island, and did you start getting involved in some, besides just teaching out here, getting involved in union or protest work or activist work out here, whether in New York City or...
Well, in Long Island and at Stony Brook, there was no union yet. That came later.
Okay.
We organized the faculty union in the early, mid-1970s, and I was involved in that campaign. But in 1967, when I came, there was a lot of activism on the campus. There was a lot of anti-war activism, anti-draft activism against, marches to the draft board in Smithtown, different kinds of teach-ins and political education that was going on, study groups that were going on, and activism, study plus active, those two things.
Yes.
So I was involved very much in that. And there was at the time the principal student organization in the United States was Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, which I was involved in forming in Ann Arbor in 1962 when I was an undergraduate. But by 1967, it had really flourished all over the country. And when I came to Stony Brook, the first week of classes, I saw signs for SDS. I went to there were like 300 students at this meeting. It was really terrific. And I had been the president of SDS in Ann Arbor, but now I had a PhD and I was a professor, assistant professor, but I was no longer a student. So I thought, well, I can't really be in SDS anymore, but I could be a faculty advisor. And so I became a faculty advisor of the students who were doing the work, and then I was also working with other faculty. All of us were very young, because it was a new university where they were hiring new PhDs from all over the country. And all of us had been involved in the anti-war movement as students, and we continued as faculty, and we, made a lot of trouble. We made a lot of trouble on the campus around war issues, around the draft, around military research, classified research. Was the university going to allow military research, accept contracts? War contracts, those were all very, very live questions. And I was quite central to the discussions and the mobilizations and the demonstrations and the arguments about that on the campus. And of course, the campus was isolated in the community. If you go into central Suffolk County, where Stony Brook is, and now you're talking about Center Reach and Selden, and you're talking about Patchogue, and you're talking about Port Jeff Station and Port Jefferson, and all these places. They didn't want Stony Brook around. They hated Ward Melville, who gave the land so that Stony Brook could be built.
Yeah.
Ward Melville was a traitor, and we were just, it was terrible that had befallen the island. So, I lived in Rocky Point, north of 25A, up in all that whole complex of these streets that were really wild. And I rented a house there with my wife for $100 a month. And on the corner of Rocky Point Road and 25A, there was a gas station. And I went into that gas station to buy a pack of cigarettes. And the cigarette machine is there. And right above the cigarette machine, somebody had put a picture of me with like target circles around my face. Get this guy. And, I had a friend, we were having lunch at the Tanglewood Diner on 347 there people at a booth next to us were saying, okay, look at these hippies over here, or let's go home and get our guns. That was the atmosphere. So it was dicey.
But you still, you kept teaching and working.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously, I think we might jump a bit, but I wanted to talk about one of your books. You started, I'm trying to remember when this book, The Working Class Majority.
The first edition came out in 2000.
Yeah.
And the second edition came out in 2012.
Okay. Was that, and then did you have a book before that too?
I had a book, I had two books before that. In 1991, I published a book through Temple University Press from Temple University in Philadelphia called Religion and Economic Justice. And before that, I had published a book when I was a graduate student, which I wrote when I was an undergraduate, called The Idea of a World University, which grew out of an interest in the Peace Corps, actually. And I started to wonder. I was in Ann Arbor when Jack Kennedy came in the campaign in October 1960. He came to Ann Arbor and gave a speech at the steps of the Michigan Union where he offered the idea of a Peace Corps. That was the very first time that he had mentioned even such a possibility. And there's a little plaque at the steps of the Michigan Union where he gave that speech commemorating that night where he talked about the Peace Corps. And I was in the audience out there among 10,000 students at 2 o'clock in the morning going wild that Kennedy had actually showed up and was giving the speech. And when he talked about the Peace Corps, that really was interesting. And I got interested in Al and Judy Guskin were graduate students, and they really took the lead in organizing real work about it. And I was sort of got involved with some of that and got interested in it. But then gradually I started to think, well, why is this Peace Corps an American project? It ought to be a global project. Instead of having Americans train American kids to go to Gabon and to Guatemala and to wherever they go, why doesn't the United Nations do that? And take people from all over the world and train them, and have the people who are training them to go into these rural areas and do this work also come from all over the world, so that it would be not a project of the United States, an American foreign policy, which I was starting to get a little nervous about. And, 1962, 63, I was starting to think, hey, maybe American foreign policy is not where the leading edge of progressive work globally would happen. Maybe it should happen through the United Nations. And so then from there came, well, okay, if we're going to bring people from all over the world together to study together, and they're going to be trained by people from all over the world, that's sort of like a university. Instead of having it be just a 6-week or 2-month training, let's have a world university, a United Nations World University. That would be an instrument for peace and for economic development globally. And I got interested in that. Ken Boulding was a faculty member in Ann Arbor, the Center for Study for Conflict Resolution. And Ken encouraged me to be interested in that. And I went to Paris and to Geneva to the archives when I was a junior in college. And I looked at all these documents about the history of this idea going all the way back to the League of Nations. And then between my junior and senior year, I wrote up my notes. Basically, I wrote a book, but I didn't know that I'd written a book. But I wrote this thing. It was a whole long manuscript. This was before there was Xerox machines, so I had carbon paper, 5 pieces of carbon paper, and I was pounding on the keys of the typewriter so that it would go through these 5 sheets so that I could have a manuscript. And then I showed it to Ken Boulding, and he gave it to Harold Taylor, who was the president of Sarah Lawrence. I'd never heard of him. And I forgot about it. This was in 1964 when I was a senior. And then in 1967, or late 66, I get a note from Southern Illinois University Press that they want to publish my book. So Harold Taylor had taken my book and edited it and created something out of it and arranged its publication. And so that was my first book.
Okay. But then also, I guess, could you talk a little bit about how your book, The Working Class Majority, came about?
Yeah. Growing up in Detroit and growing up with the UAW and with the Teamsters everywhere, it was not hard to understand that we lived in a class society. My parents wanted me to go to a good high school. So when it came time for me to go to high school, they moved out of Detroit into the suburbs so I could go to a good high school.
Yes.
And I have to say, it was a good high school. This is Bloomfield Hills High School. So going from a school where I was with kids of people working in the auto plants, I was now with kids whose parents owned the auto plants and managed them and were the senior executives and the treasurers. And the kids across the street, their father became the president and CEO of TRW, which was a major corporation. So I learned very starkly about class in those different communities that I was raised in. But when I got all involved in all this political work in the 1960s, 1970s, I was involved also in sort of the Maoist left, and the Maoist communist left for a time in the middle 1970s. And that ultimately, I thought, was a dead end, and I quit. I gave it up. But I was also a little bit at sea. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know organizationally, politically, how I was going to continue in the work that I was doing. But I noticed, this was like in the late 70s and into the 1980s, that there was a lot of work going on around Central America. And CISPAS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. And the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. A very, very major kind of a struggle. And when I looked into the people who were engaged in that and doing it, I found out that they were often religious. And that they had, sanctuary churches. So that people who had come up from El Salvador fleeing the torture and the terrible conditions, political and social conditions in El Salvador and Honduras and Nicaragua, they would come north and the churches would sponsor them and would bring them in and give them housing and give them material support, and also organize politically to challenge the Reagan administration to stop supporting these butcher regimes in Central America. And I thought, that's really interesting. And I was teaching a class on socialism, I think, or Marxism at Stony Brook at this time in 1981 or 82. And this guy comes into my office, a young guy, introduces himself as the Catholic chaplain at Stony Brook, and he wants to audit my class. He wants to sit in my class. And we talked about it, and he did. And he introduced me to liberation theology, which I had never heard of, but which these priests and these bishops and these other young seminarians and religious leaders in the United States, Protestants, they were all into this liberation theology, which was to bring the theological resources of the church into the service of the poor, into the service of people who are at the bottom of society, that the church needs to defend those people. The church needs to advocate for those people who are the least of us.
Yes.
Well, that was a new thing to me, because I knew about the Catholics because they tried to beat me up in Detroit because I killed Christ. Jew boy kills Christ, killed a Jew boy, and so I learned how to fight. And this was a whole different way of understanding what Catholic tradition was, or what Protestant tradition was, and what it was supposed to be. So I got very interested in that. And I started reading a lot of liberation theology, Latin American, European, and also American, James Cone, and other African American theologians in this country that I thought were really very interesting. Now, I'm not a religious person, and I wasn't reading it to become religious in that way, but I was reading it in a way to try to understand what kind of conversation could I have with these activists and with these leaders that would contribute to a mutual contribution to changing the society in a way that would bring up the least of us, and would challenge the racism, and would challenge the racism of the apartheid regime and of the Reagan administration that was supporting that regime, and of the American political apparatus that was supporting that regime, and also promoting racism in the continuation of racial oppression in this country. So, and here's these new allies that I never thought existed, let's have a conversation. So I organized a conference at Stony Brook on religion and economic justice in 1984. And then I did a lot more reading, and I decided I would put a book together of essays that I would solicit from secular social science people like myself and religious leaders from the Protestant, the Catholic, and the Jewish traditions, the Abrahamic traditions. Islam, I looked around and I really couldn't find much in Islam that corresponded to what we call liberation theology.
Okay.
There was issues about interest rates and the illegitimacy of interest and how to work around that, but that wasn't really quite the same thing. So this was really Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish theologians with secular social science together understanding or speaking to each other about transforming the world, transforming society, social change. And I wrote the introduction. What do I want out of this conversation? And then I sent that conversation to the people whose work I had read that I thought was the most interesting, and said, would you like to write a piece for me that would respond to this, whatever you want to say? And people wrote. And I had back and forth with them and so on. And then I had to think, well, what do I have to say? Besides the introduction, what's my contribution to this conversation? And the answer was, if you're interested in poverty, you need to know that poverty is something that happens to the working class. Mm-hmm. You can't think of the poor as this people at the bottom who are other. If that's the way you're approaching this, you're making a mistake and you're not going to solve the problem because that's not who they are. Mm-hmm. Poor people are workers who have hit hard times. Now, are there some people who are, really perpetually or chronically impoverished? Yes. And are there differences between them and the working class? Yes. But there's a lot of cycling in and out of poverty. People are poor this year, and next year they're not. Mm-hmm. Somebody's married this year, the next year she's not, and she's now poor until she gets her feet under her again. So you have to understand poverty is something which is a condition of work. It's not something that, there's the poor. The Bible says the poor shall always be with us, and there they are, so I guess the Bible's right. That's not the way to think about this. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a piece in the book. It's just a chapter called Class and Poverty in the U.S. Economy. And there was all that data, and I did research, went to the Department of Labor, and came up with information that would support what I was saying. Mm-hmm. And found that the working class is about 60% of the labor force in this country. This is not a middle-class society. It's a working-class society. So that was in that already in the mid-'80s and that book was published in 91. Okay. Got me thinking, okay, this question of class is not just something that I remember from when I was a kid and as I grew up. It's really important now. It's not just a memory. Mm-hmm. This is a social reality that has to be deeply understood. And so that piece that I wrote for that Religion and Economic Justice book sort of put me on that track intellectually to look into this some more. Mm-hmm. And in 1995, I was invited to go to Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi to give a lecture. And I gave a lecture on the class structure of the U.S., and I dug a little deeper. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, there's not been a book written about this. I mean, there were books about class, but not in a way that I felt, I had something more to say. Yeah. So let me write a book that would say what I wanted to say about this. And that's where the working class majority came from. Okay. That's a long about answer to your question, but we got to the answer.
Yes. I was going to ask about I think he was president of the DSA, Democratic Socialist. Okay. Michael Harrington.
Yes.
He wrote a book in the 60s on poverty.
Well, he wrote a book called The Other America.
Oh, The Other America.
And that book was published in 1962. Mm. And it was an extremely influential book. It was an answer, actually, to a book that Kenneth Galbraith had published in 1958 that was called The Affluent Society. Mm-hmm. And so here was this idea that Galbraith was presenting that America was a land of affluence. We'd come out of the war. We had built an industrial base that was unheard of in the world. We had unions that had won living wages and real improvements, genuine improvements in the living standards of working people in this country after the war. And so there was a certain sense that things were pretty good. And Harrington came along and said, not so fast. There's the other America, mm-hmm. right? And he wrote about poverty. Mm-hmm. And it was in that context that President Johnson declared a war on poverty.
Yes.
Right? That was because of what Harrington was talking about, and that developed a whole understanding. But again, there was a question of the poor and it was not integrated into a class analysis.
Okay.
But it still made a tremendous difference. The war on poverty really did reduce poverty. And when Nixon came in 1969 and started cutting it, poverty rates went up.
Mm-hmm.
So, in those years from 64, 65 to 68 and 69, poverty rates really were materially reduced in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And then from then forward, the conditions of the poor, and in my way of thinking, the conditions of work and the conditions of the working class have declined. And inequality has increased, and living standards have not kept up with the productivity increases and all the consequences of corporate rule in this country that have come to dominate as corporate rule has transformed every institution in society.
Mm-hmm.
Now we come to where we are today, and the progression of that leads us to the fascism that's being set up in this country as we are having our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And also, just to talk a little bit more about the book, The Working Class Majority, mm-hmm. you argue that most Americans are actually working class.
That's right.
Can you break that down for our listeners and why it matters politically?
Well, this word class has a lot of different definitions, a lot of different connotations. People think of it in very different ways. And so, as with everything, it's important to get a handle on the definition, on what is it that I'm talking about. So, often in this country, when people talk about class, what they talk about is the middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And that most people are the middle class. You listen to President Biden, and the unions built the middle class. Everybody's in the middle class, except, there's this fringe of people on the bottom who are poor, yes. And yes, there are some really rich people at the top, but those are fringes. The real core of the society is this middle class that, lives by the rules, works by the rules, works hard, lives by the rules, mm-hmm. in President Clinton's formulation. And I think that isn't a very helpful way to think about it. You can think about it that way and go right ahead, except that it isn't very helpful if you want to transform the conditions of work. If you want to really improve people's lives, it helps to understand class not as income, but as power. Class, to me, in the way I evaluate it and the way that I measure it, has to do with power. Who has power and who doesn't? So for me, the working class are people who basically don't have a lot of power and control over the work that they do. Neither the pace nor the content of the work. They get hired in, they go, they have a supervisor or a foreman that says, here's your job, this is what you do. If you got a question, talk to me. But, mm-hmm. Clock in at 8 o'clock, clock out at 4, that's your job. And most people, it turns out, that's their condition. Mm-hmm. Now, we have in our country also a kind of an image of the working class as kind of lunch bucket guys that are going into factory gates or going down into a mine shaft. That's part of the working class, but that's not getting at this question of power. Mm-hmm. So if you look at who has power and who doesn't, power is, of course, a relationship. It's not like you can have power and somebody else doesn't. Power means that you do have something of control over other people. Mm-hmm. Social power that I'm talking about. So the working class are people who, when they go to work, don't have a lot of control over the pace and content of their work. So that's factory workers, that's true. Yeah. That's coal miners, that's true. But it's also true of call center workers. Mm-hmm. It's also true of boat mechanics out here on the North Fork. It's also true of nurses' aides. It's also true of all kinds of people who are not industrial workers, who aren't factory workers, but they are workers. Now, if they don't have a lot of power and control, who does? Well, they're not just their immediate supervisors, but the big boss, right? The owners, the board of directors, the CEOs, the chief financial officers, the chief attorney. You know, the people who, when a decision has to get made, they're in the room, right? The door closes, they're in the room around that big conference table.
Yes.
That's the capitalist class.
Yes.
They basically set the terms for all the work that gets done by the people who are doing the work. They're the ones who control it. Now, they don't control it directly. They have layers of management, right? And that's the middle class. So the middle class in this country are people who are supervisors and managers. They have some authority over the people they control, but they also answer to higher authority in the hierarchy of power in a business.
Yes.
So you have managers and supervisors. You've got small business owners who are in the middle class. They just own their own business. They have a few employees. They mostly also do the work. They come out of the work in the business. So small business owners are part of this middle class. And professional people, university professors, doctors, lawyers, accountants, not bookkeepers, right? Bookkeepers, they know how to put the numbers in, but they don't control how that happens. It's the accountants that do, right? Under the supervision of the chief financial officer.
Yes.
So, in my way of thinking about class, there are these gradations of power, and now we don't have a direct measure of power. We can look up how much carpenters make in the U.S. There's a number for that. There's no number for how much power they have. Right? So I have to find something that's a proxy, that stands for, that represents power. And I take that to be occupation. Now, U.S. Department of Labor has occupational data for something like 800 different occupations. I mean, really detailed information. So I went to the Department of Labor data. So how many people are secretaries? How many people are salespeople in stores versus traveling salesmen? Right? Those different people. How many? Just add them up. So if I add up, and I'll say, here's secretaries. I'll put them in the working class. Here's bookkeepers. I'll put them in the working class. Here's accountants. I'll put them in the middle class. Here's CEOs and chief financial officers. I'll put them in the capitalist class. And I just go through the whole column of occupations. And then add them all up. And when you add them all up, what you find is that working class people are about 62 or 63% of the labor force, of people who work.
Yes.
There is a middle class, but it's the middle class of professionals, small business owners, and supervisors and managers. That's about 35% of the labor force, a little more than a third. It's not anywhere near characteristic of the society that we live in. The working class is characteristic of the society we live in. And then there's a capitalist class that's about 2%. And I actually went and looked at the data, and that's what I come up with. So I fairly comfortable saying that the working class is the majority of people in this country. Now, when we talk about class, I want to talk about it in terms of power rather than income. But I also want to say that the working class in this country exists across race and gender lines. Often in American political discourse nowadays, when we think of the working class, we think of white workers who are voting for Trump. Oh, the working class, the Republican Party wants to be the party of the working class. Now, what most people think about the working class in that context is white workers. But when they think about black workers, they don't think of them as workers, they think of them as black people. A black bus driver is black, that's true, but it's a bus driver. That's a working class position.
Yes.
Right? A black person who's working in a call center, that's a working class person. Black, it's true. But if we only think about class as white, right, the working class is white, now we're making a very, very profound mistake, because that divides the working class. It separates white people from black people and Hispanics and Asians and Native Americans who aren't white, but are in fact workers and have more in common with white workers, have more in common with them than they do with their bosses.
Yes.
Of course, white workers often don't understand that because we're not trained that way. We're not educated that way. We're not even in the popular culture. So it's a very, very important question to address in order politically to realign the political forces, the human forces in our society, so that black and white together is much more powerful for blacks and whites both. Right? And that's, to me, the key of trying to understand this interaction between race and class. There is no understanding of class without race. There's no understanding of race without class. And we see that in the white population. You also see it in the black population and the Hispanic population, where there are class differences internal to those populations that complicate what it means as a political, as a social, as a cultural matter to be black or to be white or to be Hispanic or whoever. And so what my work is trying to do is to unpack that and try to understand both how it works, what's the reality, and then what are the consequences of thinking that way in political terms.
But in terms of working class today, I think today we look at it as a society more as a diverse range of people than dividing it by race. Because even looking at, we can talk about the politics of today, whether looking at why have the working class leaned more towards the Republicans and why have the Democrats been losing the working class?
Well, now you're talking about white people, because black people, yeah, there was a marginal increase in votes among black men for Trump, but it's by no means even close to say that the black working class is leaning towards Trump. Black men who are not workers, but who are professional people or who are small business owners or managers, those black people may be attracted in some way, but even there, it's very rare.
Yes.
So, again, we have to be real careful when we say the working class is being attracted to Trump. Well, now we're talking about white workers. So the white section of the working class is being attracted towards Trump. That's true. And we can all, get into a discussion about why that is. And that's an important discussion. But the working class is not being attracted towards Trump, because that includes all these other people.
What about the Hispanic men?
Well, yeah, Hispanics are also drawn, and we can get into cultural issues about homosexuality and about women and the proper role of women and about machismo and about all those kinds of issues that are cultural, that are important. They're not nothing. But again, those things, I think, if we're going to confront what Trump is doing and the forces behind him. They are using machismo and they're using, defend women and all this stuff as a cat's paw. They don't believe in any of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what's really going on. What's really going on is that they are crushing workers. They are crushing people of color. They are consolidating as much power as they can for their billionaire interests.
Mm-hmm.
And they are ready to sacrifice the Constitution of this country. And right now, as we are speaking, they are going around picking people off the street, sending them to prison in Louisiana, and then forwarding them off to El Salvador. That is happening today, and they're proud of it. And that is not because of cultural issues. That's their story that they want to tell. That's because I'm talking about Trump, I'm talking about, the coterie of billionaires that are around him and that are kissing up to him. Those people, they don't care about homosexuality one way or the other, or about trans people one way or the other. No. That's their way of tricking people into siding with the power of capital, which ultimately, and not even so ultimately anymore, but pretty much right away, undermines the interests and the needs and the lives and the dignity of working people of all races and colors. And that's the condition that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean that we have to ignore, these cultural issues and just say, okay, there's nothing more to talk about than class power. I'm not saying that.
Mm-hmm.
But to talk about these other aspects of cultural and social and political life, you have to understand how they operate through this lens of class and class conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And what it means for the corporate world to exercise increasing power, and in doing that to undo the last century's worth of social reform, which has all been directed at limiting corporate power.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Trade Commission, to the National Labor Relations Board, to union rights, women's rights, black people's rights, Asian rights, Native American rights, all that stuff has been won over the last 100 years in a campaign to push back corporate power.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always been resisted by corporate power. And now that corporate power is coming into such dominance, not just here, but worldwide, all that's being erased.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're living through.
Yes. A little bit more about the Democratic Party and how we got here.
Right.
And just in terms of some of the Democratic Party, whether we looked at Bernie Sanders and what he was trying to do through his movement, which is more, I think, of a classic, more left-leaning in terms of what he was looking for, whereas I think with some of the other Democratic leaders, it's changed a bit, and there's been some division within the party, and whether some say it's more managerial class now, and why aren't they focused on more of a, not that it has to be like the far right populism type rhetoric, but a more of a left-wing economic populism that can really grasp all the voters and bring them together.
Right. Well, that's what Bernie is trying to do.
Yeah.
And that's what AOC is trying to do. And that's what a number of other, sort of on the left of the Democratic Party, well, let's put it this way, on the left of American political life, and they choose to work in the Democratic Party.
Because of the two parties.
Yeah, system. Because independent third parties don't have a history of success in this country. So people who have this orientation, this political class-based orientation, with an understanding of race the way I've been talking about it here, are looking for a home, a political home. And the Democratic Party, going back to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, has this history of being the working man's party.
Yes.
Now, was then. This is now. It's a whole different story. And how that happened is an interesting, and long tale of particulars. But what the overall thread is, or if you want the bottom line of that story, is that as corporate power has consolidated more and more in this country since Nixon in 1969, and especially since Reagan, the Democratic, their consolidation, corporate consolidation in all aspects of society, in the culture, in politics, in religion, in religious belief, and the characterization, for example, of pushing aside liberation theology, has always been associated with two very important ideological things: anti-communism and racism. Those things hand in glove. And so as corporate power and racism have come to have increasing influence in the society, working class power has receded, has become more limited. So if you look in the labor movement and unions, there are still unions, but way less than there used to be.
Is it more like 10%?
No, it's 10%. It used to be 35%. Well, that's a big difference. It's a qualitative difference. It's not just a difference in numbers. If you got 35%, as there was in the 1950s, you have labor leaders who are part of the conversation nationally. Now, labor leaders are never part of the national conversation. So what that has meant is politically and culturally and in religious circles, the interests and the needs and the perspective of working class people has been pushed to the margins. And that is the other side of the greater corporate power. And what we're seeing is a Democratic Party today, which is just a shell of what it was, has been transformed as corporate power has come to have more consolidated influence in the Democratic Party, so that it is no longer a working man's party or a working woman's party. It is not a party of the working class. So you have a situation now where Bernie Sanders ran for president twice in Democratic Party primaries. And each time, the Democratic Party establishment, the Democratic Party, the leaders of the Democratic National Committee, the state chairs around the country, sabotaged that campaign. Deliberately, consciously sabotaged that campaign and did what actually they wanted, which was to eradicate Bernie Sanders as a political force. They thought. Right?
Yes.
And so now you have Hillary Clinton and you have, Joe Biden. Well, and Bill Clinton before Bernie. But,
And then Obama before that.
And Obama is also part of all of this.
I had listened to an interview you had done, I think was it Bill Moy?
Done 4 interviews with Bill, yeah.
Bill. And I know you talked about, I think that was in 2008, you talked about Obama coming in, and this is in terms of whether we're talking about identity politics or race, but that it's good historically to see this happen. But in terms of what we see looking forward, is Obama going to help the working class, and like with 2008 and with Occupy Wall Street and the bailout, and somewhat of a, I don't know if you thought that was somewhat of a disappointment in that regard.
Well, Occupy was really interesting.
Yes.
It was a very important moment.
And you were giving speeches in New York?
I went down to Zuccotti Park and I gave a talk. Actually, that was the last evening or afternoon before the park was demolished by the NYPD. It just happened. Mm-hmm. But Occupy, it wasn't an organization. See, you have to build organization. And it was anarchistic in its outlook. It was so-called horizontal rather than vertical. Well, that limits what you can do, and the consistency limits your ability to consolidate. But what they did in Occupy that I think was profoundly significant and had a lasting effect, has had a lasting effect, is that 1%, 99% formulation. That really captured people, right? That there's a 1% that's, whatever you want to call them, the plutocracy, or what Bernie calls them, the billionaire class, or what I want to call them, which is the capitalist class or the ruling class. There's this core of people at the top, and that's where you have to point the arrow of struggle. Mm-hmm. Don't point the arrow down, point the arrow up. And they were able to get that into the American consciousness in a way that was profoundly transformative, I think, and set the stage for Bernie, because that was 2011. And Bernie didn't come along until 2016, right?
Yeah.
So when Bernie was talking about the billionaire class, that was his way of echoing that 1%. And he was able to do that and pick up on that in a way that I think was a very, very important and very threatening political development as far as the ruling class in this country was concerned. And so they took every step to undermine it and to crush it, which they did. And so you end up with people very frustrated and very angry at the Democratic Party. It's hopeless. And the Republican Party is even worse, and there's no political formulation. There's nowhere to go. And so people are frustrated, and they go home, and they don't know what to do, and they go on about their lives. And, the hell with all this stuff. Well, I think that's a mistake. And I think you have to fight. And I think what Bernie and what AOC are doing is trying to figure out how to recapture the Democratic Party as a progressive social democratic force. I mean, they're not out to overthrow capitalism, but they are out to really put boundaries and limits on what these people can do. And here you have Trump basically saying, if you want to do that, you're going to be in jail, or your school is going to be cut off from any federal funds if it allows this kind of stuff to go on the campus. And so that's the fight that we're in. And it's a very dangerous and very serious moment, but it is a moment that has a history of development that goes all the way back to the New Deal, which the corporate elites never really liked. They agreed with it. They allowed it because they were afraid of the socialists and the Bolsheviks, and they were afraid of the fascists, and we'll give a escape valve. And in doing that, they also structured labor relations in this country basically to undermine militant shop organizing and put it all into contracts and contract enforcement, so that now collective bargaining is a matter of the lawyers getting together. That's a whole different attitude, a whole different orientation. And so that contributes to the undermining of the left in the labor movement and of a left labor movement, which sort of is the other side of the rise of the corporate power in the shop floor, as well as in the political culture, in the everywhere in society, in religious institutions too, because these fights are going on within denominations. What does it mean to be a Catholic? What does it mean to be a Lutheran?
Mm-hmm.
And that's that whole liberation theology question. So all that's being fought out right now as we speak in this historical context, which is a context of class antagonism, or class struggle, if you want, or class contestation. And that's what we're living in, and that's my work has been involved in trying to give a focus to that and have some understanding deeper and deeper as much as I can with other people also, trying to figure this stuff out so that we know what we're fighting.
Yes.
And we know who our friends are, and we know who our enemies are, and we know what's going on, and we can put the shaft on the side and really look at what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the task. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yes. And also, we could talk a little bit about unions today, and we talked a bit about that, but in terms of just even with the state of labor today, and there has been some unionization efforts at places like Starbucks and Amazon, but are you optimistic about these recent waves?
The Starbucks organizing and the Amazon organizing are very important developments, but it's very, very hard to succeed. Now, for Starbucks, I think that there have been maybe 900 locations around the country that have actually unionized. They don't have a contract. But what they're trying to do now, and Starbucks says they're going to negotiate, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But there is some progress, some possibility of progress, especially at Starbucks now. Amazon is much harder. And it's all hard because there's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of, you get your votes, you get your cards signed, you get people eager to be in a union now, but in 4 months, 45% of them have left. And there's a whole new labor force because there's so much turnover that it's hard to have a real consolidated core that can continue and really carry it through. But the labor movement in this country faces enormously difficult legal challenges. And I should also say difficult illegal challenges. Because what the companies are doing is to challenge workers and to fire the organizers and to say, okay, and Amazon or Starbucks would do this. If you're in a union, if you vote for a union, we're not giving you a raise. But this other shop over here, this other Starbucks, will give them a raise. So we'll reward people who are not in the union.
Yes.
Well, it turns out that's illegal. So now it depends on what does the National Labor Relations Board do? Because the federal government, through the Labor Department, monitors and organizes and manages collective bargaining. So there are something called unfair labor practices. So firing your lead organizer, that's an unfair labor practice. Well, okay, come and get me. I fired the lead organizer, now do something about it. You know, it's like Trump saying, okay, I can't send them to El Salvador. Guess what? I just sent them to El Salvador. Go do something. So now you have the Trump administration, you have the National Labor Relations Board neutered. And so working people in this country have a real uphill battle. And here's an indication of it. If you ask people, do you want to be in a union? Do you support unions? About 70% of the population now says, yes, I support unions. That's much higher than it was 15 years ago, incidentally, because people are getting the picture that corporations have too much power, the boss has too much power, we need unions. Well, 70% of people want unions, but only 10% are in unions. So what happened to the other 60%? It's not because the unions aren't trying to organize them. The unions are spending a lot of resources and a lot of energy trying to organize all over the country, not just in Starbucks, but in battery plants, in the UAW, in the auto industry in South Carolina, and the steel workers and United Electrical Workers. All kinds of unions are doing this. But they can't get success. Why? In the face of workers who want to be in a union, because of management illegal practices that are undermining workers' rights to organize. Well, go do something about that. That's not so easy, particularly if you're dealing with Trump and his Labor Department and his health and education, human resources and education department. Go deal with them and see how friendly they are to unions. These guys are crushing unions. Mm-hmm. Trump put out an executive order that he's not going to negotiate with federal unions anymore. Well, that's pretty steep. Go make them. Well, it's not so easy to make them if he really doesn't want to do it. Mm-hmm. It's not so easy to get the boss to agree to a union. And if he has to agree to a union, then he has to agree to a first contract. And about a third of unions that get recognized never come to a first contract. So that's the conditions, that we face and that the labor movement faces. And it faces it coming off of this history of the increasing corporate power and the diminution of power and the marginalization of the power of class-conscious union organizers. Mm-hmm. So what you have is a labor movement that has increasingly put its money and its resources and its energy and its imagination into the Democratic Party. And that Democratic Party, as we spoke about a short while ago, is the same Democratic Party that's now run by people who want to crush Bernie Sanders and AOC. Mm-hmm. Well, so what kind of Democratic Party is that to put your money in? And that's a whole challenge that has to be organized inside the labor movement and the top leadership. And that's a hard road to hoe. There are some who are ready, like head of the Postal Workers Union, American Postal Workers Union, Neil Diamondstein, and some others. Carl Rosen, who's the president of the United Electrical Workers. So it's not like there's nobody. But there's that legacy of anti-communism and that legacy of collective bargaining that's really a matter of the lawyers rather than the mobilized rank and file. That really is a problem.
Mm-hmm. And just with the corporatization, I think we've seen movements from the Democratic Party in the past few years and corporations to at least diversify, but almost falsify, which in a way they make things so that it seems more diverse and that we have new leadership, but in the end, everyone's still struggling on the bottom of a wide range, whether you change out certain different leaders and groups or advertising companies will change up, but that's still just focusing on a more of a capitalistic class of people now. But in the end, in terms of uniting a wide range of people, I think we're still struggling with that when we create all these divisions, which I think you said are important, whether it's gender, race, but in the end, we need to get back to that wide range class, working class movement to really bring everyone together.
Yes, but you can't bring people together by ignoring their needs.
Yes.
So the idea that, a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we can just get everybody a strong working class movement. We don't have to worry about race anymore. We don't have to worry about gender. That's not true. We do have to worry about that. And white people have to worry about it, and men have to worry about it, as well as black people and Asians and all the rest, and women.
Yes.
We have a problem in this country with white supremacy. Black people can argue about white supremacy and complain about it and march and pick and do all kinds of things. Until white people put down white supremacy, it will remain. So we have to take that up. It's not just a question of, terms and conditions of employment. It's not just a question of wages and what's good for workers as a whole. Because we have a whole long history of what's good for workers as a whole turns out to be what's good for white men. And white men are disadvantaged by that in the long run, as we can see today. Because what's going on with the consolidation of billionaire power in this country is not good for white workers or anybody, any kind of workers. And the way to resolve that, the way to challenge that, is to have the broadest possible unity that confronts that power in every dimension of its application. And that means we have to take into account race and gender oppression. You can't not do that. Because if you do neglect those things and just say a rising tide lifts all boats, those constituencies are going to walk away because they're not going to find themselves.
They'll feel left out.
They will be left out. And people aren't stupid. They'll figure out that they're being left out. And then it becomes, okay, you guys want to fight? Go fight. But it's got nothing to do with me because I'm not there. If you're a woman or if you're black or whatever. So you have to bring all that in. And that's a very complicated political process.
Yes.
Because you have to unite all these people at the same time as you have to recognize the legitimate needs of black liberation in this country. That continues. We're not a beyond race in this country. We're just not. And it's white people who have to understand that and be open to the kinds of discussions and the kinds of mutual determination of agendas that are required in order to build that unity that we need to push back these people who are now fixing up fascism in this country. Because that's serious. Once that gets consolidated, very hard to get rid of it.
Yes.
Very, very hard. Franco was in power in Spain for 40 years. Mussolini was in power in Italy until the Allied army came in, and then that encouraged the Italian people to hang him up by his heels in Rome. Hitler was in power until the Red Army came to Berlin.
Yes, and then in terms of the future here, it's...
Well, we don't want any of that.
Yeah.
Well, all I'm saying is once this fascism gets consolidated, this authoritarian, and I'll say fascist because it's in behalf of capital. It's in behalf of corporations. At the expense of workers, using race and anti-trans and all these other kind of phobias and cultural things that they want to throw into the mix. We have to get rid of scientists. We have to get rid of, because they don't agree with us. We have to get rid of, liberals in the academy, or we have to make sure that there's enough, fascist voices teaching in the programs. Well, once that gets consolidated, it's very hard to undo it. Yeah. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in these midterm elections.
Yes. And then I'm curious also just about the future of work in general. Do you see, with things becoming more automated, less people, less jobs available, or even less, not I think there is somewhat of less people even wanting to work certain types of jobs, but in terms of some form of universal income coming in the future and just the way we work compared to today.
Well, there's been talk of automation, destroying the labor market since there was mechanization. The Luddites were people it's a term, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they were actual Luddites. That was a movement that wanted to destroy machinery so that they could preserve their craft jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And they did destroy machinery. They went around and they, blew up and, just destroyed early industrial production. Well, industrial production didn't end jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was beginning to study economics and thinking about these things, there was a lot of talk about automation is going to destroy jobs. There are no more jobs. The jobless future. Stanley Aronowitz wrote a whole book about the jobless future. Well, no, there are jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if AI is going to, take all the jobs and there's going to be no more jobs, or there'll only be different jobs. Now, to your question about universal basic income, in a certain kind of way, we already have that in this country. If you want to think about, and this is something I get into in this latest book of mine, The Class, Race, and Gender, about how capitalism works. How do workers get what they need to live? They have to go on the market and buy, right? So you get a wage, and with your wage, you can go to the store and get things. But you also get things from the government. You could think of it as a public wage. Education. Public education.
Yes.
Healthcare. Housing. Millions of people get housing not through their wages that they can pay, but through Section 8 or other housing subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what that says to me is that people get what they need through two streams of resources. One is their private wage, and the other is, in a sense, a public wage,
Mm-hmm.
which is provided to them either just in money, like SNAP payments, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not quite money, but you can buy, you can buy this vegetable against that vegetable. It's not vegetables. So you can buy food with it. So you get that from the government. Now, the food that you're buying or you're getting from these sources, either public or private, it's all made by working people. Everything is made by working people. That's what work does. It creates everything. So workers get back a part of what they make through their wage or through public programs.
Mm-hmm.
And those public programs are, in a way, universal basic income, except it isn't quite universal because not everybody is necessarily entitled to it. But you can imagine a social organization in which people get resources that are produced broadly by working people everywhere, not through their wage, but just from public payments.
Mm-hmm.
A public wage, which would be like a universal basic income. And you might want to do that, which we already do in unemployment compensation and workman's comp and other things like that, But you could do that in a way if you think that benefits shouldn't be dependent on employment. Because there's so much turnover in employment. Used to be, you got a job at Dodge, Maine in Detroit, and you're going to work there the rest of your life, and your son is going to work there too. And maybe your dad worked there. It was, people worked for a company. They worked for IBM. My dad worked for Albert Kahn. It was an architectural firm. He worked there 38 years. There was never any question that he was going to get laid off or that he was going to leave, because that was his job and he got his livelihood from there, and it was fine. He could do his work. Mm-hmm. Now that's not how people work. There's this tremendous turnover. Well, if there's all this turnover, maybe we don't need a situation, or it isn't a good idea to have a situation where people rely on their employment for the lion's share of their sustenance. So there's your universal basic income. Well, where would the government get that money? Well, from all the production that workers are doing as they're moving around. There's instability in their employment, but they're always working, right? So they're always creating product, and now we have to find a mechanism so that they can get some of that back. And maybe we could structure a kind of universal basic income that it doesn't matter where you work or if you work, like unemployment compensation. You can find some sort of sustenance, and that might be a different way of sustaining a workforce than what we have done in the past, if we have these tremendous increases in productivity that come from AI or whatever we might imagine on the technical side. Fine.
There's positive in that there would be less exploitation, and when you don't have workers in those positions, but then you hope that with if people weren't working those jobs, then they would have a good income, at least, and that it wasn't just the bare bones of a universal.
Well, that would be the discussion, right?
Yeah. But it in some ways it is, in some of those jobs, I think then you don't have to worry about that as much, but then the corporations are happy because they don't have to deal with any labor. They just work with automated machines, but it's kind of a hard balance there with.
Well, we'll see, if they have to only deal with machines, because somebody has to maintain the machines, someone has to build the machines, someone has to wire the machines, someone has to put the little tiny screws right into the iPhones. Somebody has to do that.
Yes. That's not all
robots. Now, maybe it will turn out to be all robots. Well, fine. Mm-hmm. Now, you could think of it like a minimum wage. Mm-hmm. Well, here, let me introduce Sam Pizzigati into the conversation. Sam Pizzigati was a journalist. He was the head of publications for the National Education Association, which is the biggest union of teachers in the country. Mm-hmm. Couple million, 2.5 million teachers in the National Education Association. And Sam Pizzigati had this idea a long time ago now. Let's not have minimum wage. That's a mistake. What we want to do is we want to have a maximum wage, not a minimum, but a maximum wage. And the maximum is not a number of dollars. It's a multiple of the lowest wage in the place. Mm-hmm. So, the boss needs more money than the workforce. Okay. How much? 10 times more? 20? 100 times more? 7 times more? Let's have a discussion. Let's have a social conversation about what should be the gap between the top and the bottom in any company. Mm-hmm. So if the manager let's say, is allowed to make 30 times what the base worker is making. So the base worker is making $10 an hour. So the top manager can get $300 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of money, $300 an hour. But it's a multiple. Now, if the boss wants more, wants $350,000, he's going to have it. But now you have to raise that $10 to be 1/40th of your top.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, yeah, the boss can have more money, but the workers have to have more money too.
Yes.
Because it's all expressed as a ratio of the top to the bottom. There's nowhere in there is there a number of dollars. So if you do that, then with this universal basic income, you can also try to figure out what's private, what's public, and what is the spread. Those are all things that are subject to public discussion.
Mm-hmm. Now, just with what we've talked about, and throughout your career, you've balanced academic activism and you've been in community roles. How do you think scholars today can stay engaged with communities they live in and not just study them from a distance?
I think that intellectuals have to and always do start with a question.
Mm-hmm.
What am I interested to understand? And I would say start with a question that's grounded in lived experience, rather than start with a question that's grounded in the theoretical literature about lived experience.
Yes.
Right?
Definitely.
So that, I think, is the first step. What's the question?
Mm-hmm.
Where does the question arise? And I think that for me, the question arises in the lived experience of working people. And what do I need to do to make a contribution to improving those conditions with the skills and the knowledge and the energy that I have? And that's what I've been doing, for a long time, all the way back to when I was an undergraduate.
Yes.
And I was doing these, picket lines at Woolworths and civil rights and ban the bomb and we don't want to die in nuclear war and, the duck and cover drills, which I did when I was a child. Everybody did. You get under the desk or you go down in the basement where all the pipes are and you can see the ceiling. It's all pipes. And now we're going to get blown up. Well, how do we stop that? So for me, the activism was to confront those immediate problems, whether it was Emmett Till or the bomb or whatever, and be active about it. So that's the picket lines and that's the going to meetings and trying to organize people to confront these things. But when we were active as undergraduates in Ann Arbor and all over the country, all of us in SDS and other student uprisings that were happening, we all read like mad. And it wasn't reading what we were given in class, because that didn't have anything to do with what was going on. That had to do with some theoretical issues that somebody was interested in. But why was there war? Or why was there racism? When we took that question to our professors, they didn't really have much to say, it turned out. So we went and read. Who has something to say about this? What can we learn? And that walking on two legs of theory and practice and developing your understanding in the context of lived experience was what I did and so many others of that generation.
Yes.
And I would say that is what I continue to do, because I continue to be involved in union organizing and international peace work around the war in Iraq, for example, and in Afghanistan, and I was in Iran in 1980, and all kinds of other kinds of ways of confronting and thinking about, as a practical matter, what was going on in my society. And then from that, what do I have to understand? What do I have to read? What do I have to research? What do I have to write? What is the new question that has to be asked that will open some door to make things better? And that's how I do my work. Now, that's how I think everybody should do their work, but certainly in the social sciences.
Yes.
Right. And now if you're a physicist or if you're an astronomer, there may be some differences there. But like in medical technology or in biomedical research, what's the question? What are you trying to solve? What's the disease? What's the pathogen you're trying to understand? How does that pathogen work? Well, that's very grounded. So that's, what I would say. Now, there's also big theoretical discussions about physics that you can get into, and mathematics and all the sciences, and in economics and everywhere else where you can get off someplace that can be very valuable in some instances, particularly in the sciences. Yeah. I don't think in the social sciences it's all that valuable.
No. I mean, it could be a turnoff if you start getting into those theoretical conversations if you want to just have a conversation with people and discuss the problems that are happening and understand it that way. Even when talking with the general public, it could be a turnoff too. But why there is some attraction to that populism, because it's more, I don't want to say simplified, but mostly lies within that rhetoric, especially from the right.
Well, that's true, but on the left, it's always important to talk to people in a way that they can understand. Mm-hmm. So when I write or go into a church basement and talk, or to some social justice committee in a Catholic church or in a temple or wherever. Mm-hmm. Here on the North Fork, I've done it, or all over the country, I've done it, or in a union hall. Mm-hmm. It's not a classroom. It's although they're there to listen, and so break it down and talk in a way that people can understand. And I hope, for example, in our conversation that we've had today, that people could listen in and they would understand what I was talking about. They might not agree with it, but it's understandable. Mm-hmm. It relates to their experiences in some way. And that's what I'm trying to do. And, some people are good at that. Some people are not so good at that. Mm-hmm. But that's a skill and a discipline that I think is important for intellectuals to develop. So some people like Bernie can go talk to 37,000 people and they get it.
Yes.
Right? AOC can go talk to 37,000 people and they get it. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very important skill. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to develop those skills. And the way to develop first is to want to do it. And then to do it and go talk to people. Mm-hmm. And in the talking to people is the immersion of the academic into lived experience, where you find ways to communicate, you find ways to understand and bring people to the conversation so that you can also learn from them. Mm-hmm. Which means that you have to go to people with a certain degree of humility and respect because you want to listen. And you can't organize if you're not ready to listen.
Yes. And then just one last question. It might overlap a little bit with what we just talked about, because that was a good lesson for future people too, in terms of organizing and working with people. But if you could pass on one lesson from your decades of work in labor, organizing and local politics that you believe the next generation absolutely needs to hear, what would it be?
Listen to the people.
Listen to the people.
Listen to the people. Mm-hmm. Listen to people. Now, I'll give you an example. I think in 1995 or 97 was that UPS strike. I don't know if you remember that.
No.
But there was a national strike of UPS all over the country. And it was around part-time work and converting part-time jobs to full-time jobs with benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Ron Carey was the president of the Teamsters Union at the time. And I once talked to him about that strike and how it went. And he said the most important thing was that when people were on the picket line, we told them, if a reporter comes and asks you a question, talk to the reporter. Don't say, oh, the public relations guy is Joe down on the corner, the guy in the green shirt. Why don't you go talk to him? If somebody comes and talks to you, you talk back and say what's on your mind. Say why you're on this picket line. Because it's your picket line. And it was enormously powerful because the voices that people heard on the TV and on the radio from those interviews were the voices of people who were actually doing the work and were on that picket line because they needed something. They needed something enough to get them onto that picket line. And their voices resonated with people all across the country that generated the public support for that strike that forced UPS into a settlement that was satisfactory to the workers. Listen to the people. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be afraid of what people will say.
Absolutely. Just one last question. Is there any particular moment from your career, either inside or outside the classroom, that stands out to you as a moment of personal transformation or an epiphany?
Well, I think the epiphany that I mentioned before in my observation of Emmett Till and his murder, that was a definite epiphany. Mm-hmm. And I had another when I was a sophomore in college. I was taking an advanced calculus class, and it met 5 days a week, and we had homework in every class period that was due the next day. Mm-hmm. And it was an honors section, so there were a bunch of smart people in there. And there was a woman in there, I can't exactly remember her name, but I have her face very much in mind. And the professor, who was Nicholas Kazarinoff, he was a math professor, he handed back the homeworks to people, and in doing that, called out this one woman who was in the class by name and said, let's call her Clara, but that wasn't her name, but, Clara really had this down. She really had insight into how to solve this problem. As soon as he said the word insight, I knew I didn't have it. And I knew I was in the wrong place. And that helped me to move away from the mathematical and physical sciences into the social sciences, where I felt I did have some intuition about what the world was that I was engaging. But when he said that about this math problem, that was an epiphany for me, that I was in the wrong place.
Yes. That's when you knew you wanted to switch.
Well, that's when I knew that I was in the wrong place, that I needed to switch.
Yeah.
That was when I just understood that I could hack my way through these assignments, which I was doing, and I was doing okay as far as grades. But that connection, that deep connection to the material and to the organization of thought that requires you to make progress in a field. Boy, when he said that, I knew, and that was a real, also epiphanal moment for me.
Yes. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and your career and all the work you've done. It was really nice to talk to you today.
It was a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 139 with Michael Zweig. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.